Romeo and Juliet. Act 1. The Feud and the First Meeting. In the vibrant and bustling city of Verona, two noble families, the Montagues and the Capulets, are embroiled in a deep and bitter feud that has lasted for years. The story begins with a street brawl between servants of the two households, which quickly escalates when Benvolio, a peace-loving Montague and cousin to Romeo, tries to break up the fight. However, Tybalt, a fiery Capulet and Juliet's cousin, arrives on the scene and provokes Benvolio, causing the fight to spread throughout the city. The Prince of Verona, Aeschylus, arrives just in time to stop the riot, declaring that any further disturbances will be punishable by death. Meanwhile, Romeo, the only son of Lord and Lady Montague, is brooding over his unrequited love for a woman named Rosaline. He speaks with Benvolio, who advises him to forget Rosaline and look at other women. Romeo, though melancholic, agrees to attend the Capulet ball that evening, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rosaline. The Capulet ball is a grand and opulent affair, with guests from all over Verona in attendance. Unbeknownst to the Capulets, Romeo, along with his friends Mercutio and Benvolio, sneaks into the party wearing masks. As Romeo wanders through the crowd, he catches sight of Juliet, the daughter of Lord Capulet, and is immediately struck by her beauty. The two exchange glances, and it is love at first sight. They speak briefly, sharing a flirtatious and tender moment. However, their happiness is short-lived when they both discover each other's identities. Juliet is a Capulet, and Romeo is a Montague. Despite the knowledge of their family's enmity, they are irresistibly drawn to one another. Before parting, Romeo and Juliet share a passionate kiss, sealing their newfound love. Tybalt, who recognizes Romeo at the party, is enraged by his presence and vows to seek revenge. But Lord Capulet, not wanting to cause a scene at his party, restrains him, telling him to let it go for now. Act 2. The balcony scene and secret marriage. Later that night, unable to stay away from Juliet, Romeo sneaks into the Capulet orchard, hoping to see her again. As he hides among the trees, he overhears Juliet speaking to herself on her balcony, expressing her love for him despite knowing that he is a Montague. Romeo steps out of the shadows and reveals himself to Juliet, and the two confess their mutual love. They lament the feud between their families, but their love for each other is too strong to be denied. In one of the most famous scenes in all of literature, they exchange vows of eternal love and decide to marry in secret. The next day, Romeo seeks out Friar Lawrence, a kind and wise priest who has been a mentor to him. Romeo tells Friar Lawrence of his love for Juliet and asks him to marry them in secret. Although the friar is initially shocked by Romeo's sudden shift in affection from Rosaline to Juliet, he agrees to perform the ceremony, hoping that the marriage might help to reconcile the feuding families. Juliet sends her nurse, a trusted servant and confidant, to meet Romeo and arrange the details of the marriage. The nurse, who is deeply devoted to Juliet, teases her about Romeo, but eventually delivers his message. That afternoon, Romeo and Juliet are married in Friar Lawrence's cell, with only the nurse and the friar as witnesses. Their joy is overwhelming, but they must part quickly, as Romeo needs to leave before anyone discovers their secret. Act 3. The Fight and Romeo's Banishment. Soon after their wedding, tragedy strikes. Tybalt, still furious from the encounter at the Capulet ball, confronts Romeo in the streets of Verona, challenging him to a duel. Romeo, now secretly related to Tybalt through his marriage to Juliet, refuses to fight him, trying to keep the peace. Mercutio, Romeo's close friend and a witty, hot-tempered nobleman, is disgusted by Romeo's refusal and steps in to fight Tybalt himself. The two engage in a fierce duel, but when Romeo tries to intervene to stop the fight, Tybalt fatally wounds Mercutio under Romeo's arm. As Mercutio dies, he curses both the Montagues and Capulets, blaming their feud for his death. Overcome with grief and anger, Romeo forgets his desire for peace and challenges Tybalt to a duel, killing him in a fit of rage. Realizing the gravity of what he has done, Romeo flees the scene as the prince arrives. The prince, after hearing the account of the events from Benvolio, declares that Romeo is to be banished from Verona. If he is found within the city, he will be put to death. Juliet, unaware of the day's tragic events, eagerly awaits her husband in her chambers. When the nurse arrives with news of Tybalt's death and Romeo's banishment, Juliet is devastated. Her emotions are torn between grief for her cousin and love for her husband. However, her love for Romeo ultimately prevails, and she longs to see him again before he must leave Verona. Romeo, hiding at Friar Lawrence's cell, is equally distraught. He feels that banishment is worse than death because it means being separated from Juliet. Friar Lawrence counsels him to be patient and to take comfort in the fact that Juliet is alive and still loves him. He arranges for Romeo to spend the night with Juliet before fleeing to Mantua, a nearby city, where he will remain until the situation can be resolved. That night, Romeo and Juliet share their wedding bed for the first and only time. They are both heartbroken, knowing that this might be their last moment together. As dawn approaches, Romeo reluctantly leaves Juliet's room, promising to find a way for them to be together again. Act 4. Juliet's desperation and the friar's plan. After Romeo's departure, Juliet is faced with a new crisis. Her parents, unaware of her marriage, have arranged for her to marry Paris, a wealthy and noble suitor who has been pursuing her hand in marriage. When Juliet refuses, her father, Lord Capulet, becomes enraged, threatening to disown her if she does not comply. Desperate and with nowhere else to turn, Juliet seeks out Friar Lawrence for help. The friar, understanding the gravity of the situation, devises a daring plan. He gives Juliet a potion that will make her appear dead for 42 hours. During this time, she will be placed in the Capulet family tomb. Friar Lawrence plans to send word to Romeo in Mantua, instructing him to return to Verona and retrieve Juliet when she awakens. The two can then escape together, free from their family's feud. Juliet, determined to be with Romeo, agrees to the plan. That night, she takes the potion and falls into a death-like sleep. The next morning, when her family discovers her lifeless body, they are overcome with grief. Believing that she has died, they lay her to rest in the family tomb, unaware of the friar's plan. Act 5. The tragic conclusion. Meanwhile, in Mantua, Romeo receives news of Juliet's death from his servant Balthazar, who is unaware of the friar's scheme. Devastated and believing Juliet to be truly dead, Romeo decides that life is not worth living without her. He purchases a vial of poison from a poor apothecary and sets off for Verona, determined to die beside Juliet. Romeo arrives at the Capulet tomb and finds Paris there, mourning Juliet's death. Paris, believing Romeo has come to desecrate the tomb, challenges him to a fight. In the ensuing struggle, Romeo kills Paris and enters the tomb. Inside, Romeo is overwhelmed by the sight of Juliet's lifeless body. He speaks to her, expressing his love and sorrow, and then drinks the poison, dying beside her. Moments later, Juliet awakens from her death-like sleep and finds Romeo dead beside her. In a state of shock and despair, she tries to kiss the poison from his lips, but when it does not work, she takes Romeo's dagger and stabs herself, joining him in death. Soon after, Friar Lawrence arrives at the tomb, only to find the tragic scene before him. As the news spreads, the prince, the Capulet, and the Montague families all arrive at the tomb. The friar, filled with guilt, confesses the entire story, explaining how their feud led to the deaths of the two young lovers. The prince, saddened and angered by the senseless loss of life, chastises both families for their hatred. Overcome with grief and remorse, Lord Capulet and Lord Montague agree to end their feud. They vow to honour Romeo and Juliet, by erecting golden statues in their memory, symbolizing the reconciliation of their houses. Conclusion. Romeo and Juliet is a timeless and tragic tale of love, fate, and the destructive power of hatred. The story explores the intensity of young love and the lengths to which people will go to be with those they love, even in the face of insurmountable obstacles. It also serves as a powerful reminder of the devastating consequences that can arise from prejudice, violence, and the refusal to forgive. The deaths of Romeo and Juliet, though heartbreaking, ultimately bring peace to their families, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the tragedy.